The hospital monitor was still beeping when my husband's sister grabbed the IV line out of my arm and threw it on the floor. "Sign the papers or I'll have security throw you out," she hissed, leaning so close I could smell the coffee on her breath. "You don't belong here. You never did." I was 3 days out of surgery. My ribs were taped from where I'd cracked two of them. The bruise on my temple had gone the color of a rotten plum, and she stood over me in my hospital room, waving a folder of documents like she was doing me a favor by letting me read them before I lost everything. "I'm going to tell you the whole thing, because for a long time I couldn't. For almost a year I'd start to, and my throat would close up. But it's spring now, and I'm sitting on a porch I never thought I'd own, watching my daughter chase a dog across the grass, and I think I can finally say it out loud. My name is Tamsin. I'm 31, and 2 weeks before that woman ripped the needle out of my arm, I had a life I thought nothing could touch. I had a husband named Cormac. I had a small apartment over a bakery in a town where everyone knew my name. And I had a father-in-law, a man named Hollis Aldecott, who treated me more like a real daughter than my own family ever had. Hollis built docks, started with one rotting marina on the lake when he was 22 and turned it into a marine construction company worth, I would later learn, somewhere north of $12 million. He had calloused hands and a soft voice, and he called me kiddo right up until the day he died. Cormac died first. A logging truck crossed the center line on Route 9 on a Tuesday in October. The state trooper told me he didn't suffer, which is the thing they always say, and I've never been able to decide if it's a kindness or a lie. I was 29. We'd been married 4 years and we'd just started talking, really talking, about having a baby. So that's where I was. A widow before 30, living off a small insurance payout and the kindness of a man who'd lost his only son and had nobody left but me. Hollis took it hard. Of course he did. But somewhere in the grief, the two of us became something like family. I'd drive out to his big house on the bluff on Sundays and make him eat something green. He taught me how to read the lake, how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the water went flat and silver. He told me Cormac used to do the same drive every Sunday, and that having me there made the house feel less like a museum. He had other people in his life, technically. A daughter, Cormac's older sister, named Genevieve, and a stepdaughter, a woman named Oddiles, who'd come into the picture about 2 years before, after Hollis remarried a woman named Sabine. Sabine. I should have paid more attention to Sabine. Genevieve, I'd known for years. She'd never liked me. She thought Cormac had married down, and she wasn't subtle about it. But she lived 4 states away, and we mostly stayed out of each other's way. Sabine and Odalise were the new variable. Sabine was Hollis's second wife, married to him for only about 18 months. Elegant, cool, the kind of woman who made you feel like your shoes were wrong. And Odalise was her daughter from somewhere before, or sharp smiles and expensive perfume, who'd recently moved into the guest house on Hollis's property to help out. I didn't think much of any of it. I was busy being sad. Then Hollis got sick. It started slow. He got tired. His heart, the doctor said, was acting irregular. He had a known condition, had for years, took a small white pill every morning for it. Now he was dizzy, nauseous, confused some afternoons. I'd call and he wouldn't quite sound like himself. I chalked it up to age and grief and the long winter. But the last few weeks he changed in a way that scared me. He got paranoid. One Sunday, he met me at the door instead of letting me in, walked me down to the dock, and asked me in a low voice whether I'd ever noticed Odalise fussing with his bills. I laughed it off. I told him he was tired. He grabbed my wrist harder than he ever had and said, "Kiddo, if something happens to me, you call a man named Sutcliffe. He's my lawyer. You promise me." I promised. I thought it was the fear talking. Hollis died on a Thursday in February. Heart failure, the death certificate said. I found out from a voicemail Sabine left me, cool as anything, that the funeral would be Saturday and that the family had already made the arrangements. 3 days after the funeral, Genevieve and Sabine and Odalise came to my apartment. They didn't call first. I heard the knock and opened the door. And there were all three of them, in dark coats, standing on my little landing over the bakery like a panel of judges. Genevieve had flown in. Sabine had a leather portfolio under her arm. Odalise was already looking past me into my apartment, taking inventory, the way you'd case a thrift store. "We need to talk about the estate," Genevieve said, and walked in without being invited. What they told me, sitting at my own kitchen table, drinking my own coffee, was this. Hollis had signed a new will 3 weeks before he died. It left everything the company, the house, the accounts to Sabine, and split between the two of them. I got nothing. There was, Sabine said with a thin smile, a small bequest as a courtesy. $15,000. If I signed a waiver agreeing not to contest the estate, I'd get it. If I made trouble, I'd get nothing and a lawsuit besides. I sat there and I felt like the floor was tilting, not because of the money. I want you to understand that. It was never the money. It was that Hollis had told me 100 times sitting on that dock exactly what he wanted. He told me Cormac's share was to come to me. He told me the company employees had a profit-sharing fund he protected for 30 years. He told me the house on the bluff should stay in the blood. And now these three women were telling me he'd changed his mind in the last 3 weeks of a life, when he could barely remember what day it was. "I want to see the will," I said. "The real one." That's when Genevieve's face did the thing I'd seen Cormac's do when he was furious, that family flush up the neck. "This is the real will," she snapped. "He finally came to his senses about you. I told them I'd be calling a lawyer. I told them to get out of my apartment." Sabine paused at the door, pulled her coat tight, and said, "You have no idea what you're stepping into." At the time, I thought it was a threat about lawyers. I know now it was something much worse. I called the number Hollis had given me the next morning. Sutcliffe, an old man semi-retired who'd known Hollis for 40 years. When I said my name, there was a long silence on the line. And then he said, very quietly, "He told me you might call. Can you come in today?" I drove out to his office, a little wood-paneled place above a hardware store, with a woman named Rue waiting for me in the lot. Rue was Hollis's neighbor and oldest friend, 74 years old, a retired insurance fraud investigator who'd spent 30 years catching people who burned down their own warehouses for the payout. She had reading glasses on a beaded chain and a stare that could strip paint. Hollis had called her the night before he died, she told me, and asked her to look after the kid, meaning me. In that office, the floor really did fall out from under me. Sutcliffe had Hollis's actual will, the real one filed and witnessed 2 years prior, never revoked, never amended. It left Cormac's share and after Cormac's death, my share by survivorship intact. It protected the employee fund in writing. It left the house to me with a note in Hollis's own hand. "Tamsin loves this water like my boy did. Let her keep it." The thing Sabine and Genevieve had waved at me was a forgery, a bad one, Sutcliffe said. The notary stamp belonged to a man who'd surrendered his commission a year earlier. But that wasn't the part that made me cold. Rue had been quiet, flipping through copies of Hollis's medical records that Sutcliffe had pulled. She set them down and took off her glasses and said, "Honey, I don't think your father-in-law died of his heart." Hollis took a heart medication, a common one derived from a plant digitalis, the foxglove drug. In the right dose, it kept his heart steady. In the wrong dose, it stopped it. And Rue, running her finger down 6 months of pharmacy refills, found something that didn't add up. The prescriptions had been refilled twice as fast as the dosage on the bottle would allow. Somebody had been giving him extra, slowly, over months, building it up in his blood until his heart finally couldn't take it. Somebody in that house had been poisoning him. I drove home in a daze, and that night, at 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of someone trying my door handle. I lived alone over a closed bakery on a quiet street. I lay frozen, listening to the knob turn back and forth, and then to footsteps going down the stairs, fast. In the morning, there were fresh scratches around the lock. I called the police and they took a report and looked at me like I was a hysterical widow. But Rue believed me. Rue had me pack a bag and move into her spare room that same day. "They're scared," she said. locking her deadbolt. Scared people get sloppy. She was right. What broke open the whole thing was, of all people, Odalise. It turned out Odalise had a habit of complaining about her family to anyone who'd listen, and the someone who'd been listening for 2 months was a bartender at the Marina restaurant named Pim, who happened to be the second cousin of Hollis's longtime foreman. Odalise, 3 margaritas deep on a Friday, had told Pim that her mother knew how to handle old men with bad hearts, and that this was the fourth time, and that she, Odalise, was sick of moving every couple of years. Pim hadn't thought much of it until Hollis turned up dead. Then he told the foreman, and the foreman told Rue, and Rue's old eyes lit up like a slot machine. Because that one drunk sentence was a thread, and Rue pulled it, and the whole sweater came apart. Sabine, it turned out, was not Sabine. Or rather, Sabine was one of several names a woman had used over the past 15 years. Rue and a detective named Ferris, who Rue dragged in by sheer force of personality, started pulling marriage and death records across 3 states. A pattern came up out of the data like a body surfacing in the lake. Husband 1, a retired contractor in another state, married her after a whirlwind courtship, dead of cardiac arrest within 2 years, estate to the new widow. Husband 2, a widower, owned a chain of car washes, heart trouble, dead in 3 years, estate to the widow. Husband 3, a gentleman with a known arrhythmia and a lake house and grown children who'd hated his new wife, dead in 18 months. The children had suspected. They'd never been able to prove a thing. And husband 4, Hollis Aldecott, net worth $12 million and a company that touched half the docks on the lake. She targeted men with hearts that already needed medicine. That was the genius and the horror of it. A man with a known heart condition who dies of heart failure doesn't get an autopsy. He just gets buried. And his medicine, the very thing keeping him alive, becomes the weapon, because who's going to question a dose? But she hadn't done it alone this time. This time she'd had Genevieve. That was the part I couldn't stomach. Genevieve was Hollis's own daughter, Cormac's own sister, blood. And somewhere along the way, Sabine had figured out that Genevieve was drowning in debt. She'd run a boutique into the ground, owed 3 different lenders, was about to lose her own home, and Sabine had offered her a way out. Help me, and we split it. Genevieve had handled the forged will because she knew her father's signature. Genevieve had been the one to push for cremation fast, before anyone could ask questions. Genevieve had sat at my kitchen table drinking my coffee 3 days after helping murder her own father. And Odalise, drunk, loud-mouthed Odalise, knew enough to bring all of them down. I have to tell you about the night the laptop turned up, because it's the thing Rue is proudest of, and she'll tell anyone who stands still long enough. Hollis's house on the bluff had a finished basement office where he kept the company servers. He was old-fashioned and didn't trust the cloud. After his death, Sabine had moved in but hadn't bothered with the basement. Rue, who still had a key Hollis had given her years ago for emergencies, let herself in one afternoon while the women were out at the lawyer's, went down to that basement, and found Hollis's old desktop still humming away. He'd left himself logged into his email. Years of it. And in a folder labeled, devastatingly, for the kid, she found everything Hollis had known. That's the thing that still wrecks me. In his last months, frightened and confused, he'd figured out he was being poisoned, and instead of running, he'd quietly built a case. He'd photographed his own pill bottles next to a calendar. He'd written down the dates Odalise helped with his medicine. He'd scanned the foreman's notes about money disappearing from the company accounts, because Genevieve, it turned out, had also been quietly looting the firm to pay her lenders. He'd written me a letter and saved it as a draft he never sent, because, he said in it, he was afraid that if he moved too soon, they'd hurt me to get to him. He wanted enough proof that it would be airtight. He chose to endure it, to protect me. I read that letter in Rue's kitchen, and I put my head down on the table, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. He let himself die slow, so that they couldn't get away with it, and couldn't hurt me trying. I will never, as long as I live, deserve what that man did for me. The arrests came on a grey morning in April. They took Sabine first, then Genevieve, then Odalise, who immediately offered to testify against both of them in exchange for a deal, because of course she did. The trial was the strangest theater I've ever sat through. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Adeze, laid Sabine's history out for the jury one husband at a time, putting their photographs up on a screen, and the courtroom got very, very quiet. She brought in the grown children of husband three who'd flown across the country to finally say out loud what they'd known in their bones for years. She brought in the pharmacy records, the refill timeline that didn't make sense, the toxicology from Hollis's blood, because, thank God, the medical examiner had drawn samples before the cremation, and the digitalis level in them was 3 times what any living man could survive. Odalise testified in a dress better suited to a nightclub and managed to incriminate everyone, including herself, in the space of 20 minutes. Mom said he was dying anyway, she said, inspecting her nails. She said we were just speeding it up. She said there'd be $12 million. I didn't think it was like my job to ask questions. The jury looked at her like she was something they'd found under a dock. The forged will sank Genevieve. The notary, facing his own charges, testified that she'd paid him cash to stamp a document he never witnessed. The foreman testified about the money she'd bled from the company, money that belonged to men and women who'd worked the docks for 30 years. One of them, a woman near retirement named Bess, broke down on the stand describing what that fund meant to her, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including mine. But the moment that undid me was when Sutcliffe read Hollis's letter into the record. The part where he wrote that he knew and that he stayed and that he did it for Cormac's girl. The judge called a recess. He just stood up and walked out, and the bailiff said court would resume in 15 minutes, and half the gallery sat there weeping. The jury was out for under an hour. Sabine got life without parole on 4 counts, the 3 previous husbands finally named for what they were. She never changed expression. Not once, not even at sentencing. She just looked at me across the courtroom with those cool eyes, and I understood that to a woman like that, I was never a person at all. None of us were. We were transactions. Genevieve got 30 years murder, fraud, theft from the pension fund. She wept and said Sabine had manipulated her, that she'd never meant for it to go so far. Maybe that was even true. But she sat at my table. She drank my coffee. She buried her father in a hurry so the poison wouldn't be found. I have no forgiveness in me for her, and I've stopped pretending I should. Odalise got 8 years and an immunity deal she'll spend the rest of her life bragging about. Last I heard, she was trying to sell a podcast. Here is the part I hold on to. The company didn't die with Hollis. The employees rallied. The court restored the pension fund with the money recovered from Genevieve's lenders and the frozen accounts, and Bess got to retire on time. They asked me to take over, me, who knew nothing about marine construction except how to read a storm coming off the water. And I said yes because I couldn't stand to let the thing Hollis built fall into nothing. I learned it the way he learned it, from the dock up, with the foreman teaching me the way he'd taught Cormac. We're building the new public marina this summer. The one Hollis sketched on a napkin for 15 years and never broke ground on. I wear his old cap when I'm on site. The men pretend not to notice when I have to step away and pull myself together. Rue got a plaque from some investigators association and wore a t-shirt to the ceremony that read, "Ask an old lady." She comes for dinner every Thursday and tells the story of the basement laptop, a little bigger each time. And I kept the house on the bluff. Hollis's note made sure of that. I sit on that dock most evenings now, and I read the water the way he taught me, and some nights I swear I can hear his voice telling me a storm's coming. Go inside, kiddo. There's one more thing. About a year after the trial, the medical examiner's office, a man named Okonkwo, who'd handled Hollis's samples, asked me to coffee to follow up on a paperwork detail, and the coffee turned into dinner, and the dinner turned into the gentlest year of my life. He's nothing like the people who try to take everything from me. He reads every contract twice and laughs at his own jokes and treats me like I'm something precious instead of something to be inventoried. I told him I was scared. After Cormac, after all of it, I was terrified to want anything again. He held my hand and said we could go as slow as I needed or not at all, and either way he wasn't going anywhere. We married last fall on the dock, with Rue and Sutcliffe as witnesses and the foreman crying into his sleeve. My daughter is 14 months old now. I named her after no one in either of those poisoned families. I named her after the lake, after the water Hollis loved, after the man who let himself die slowly. So a girl who wasn't even his blood could keep her life. They thought I was nothing. A widow they could push off a landing, a name they could leave out of a will, a transaction they could close. They were so sure I'd sign whatever they put in front of me and disappear. I think about that, sometimes out on the dock with my daughter asleep against my chest, and the water going flat and silver the way it does before the weather turns. They were wrong about the only thing that mattered. I was never the one who was weak. For a long time, I believed the people who hurt me were simply stronger than I was. They had money, lawyers, a forged document, and the kind of confidence that comes from having done a terrible thing before and walked away clean. Sabine had buried 3 husbands and never once flinched. Genevieve drank my coffee at my own table 3 days after helping kill her own father. And me? I was a widow with cracked ribs and a $15,000 bribe slid across a folder. On paper, I never stood a chance. But here is what I understand now, sitting on a dock that belongs to me, that I didn't understand then. The thing that brought them down wasn't luck. It was the slow, patient consequence of who each of us chose to be. Sabine was clever, but she built her whole life on a lie, and a lie only holds as long as nobody pulls the thread. Hollis pulled it. A frightened, sick old man who could barely remember what day it was, still had the clear conscience to refuse to die quietly, and so he documented everything, photographed his bills, saved the letter, planted the proof in a folder marked for the kid. He didn't have a weapon or a plan to fight back physically. What he had was the refusal to let a wrong stand. That choice, made in the dark while he was being poisoned, is the only reason I'm alive and whole. And Rue, 74 years old, reading glasses on a beaded chain, who looked at a pharmacy printout and saw murder where the police saw a sad old man's heart giving out. That was sharpness, yes, but it was also the patience to keep asking why, when everyone else had stopped. The smartest thing isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's just refusing to accept the easy answer. What I had to learn for myself was the last piece. After Cormac died, then Hollis, then the ivy ripped out of my arm, every part of me wanted to take the $15,000 and disappear. Signing would have been easier. Grief makes you tired in a way that goes all the way to the bone. The hardest thing I ever did was keep standing up when staying down would have hurt less. I learned the marine business from the dock up at 31 because I refused to let the thing Hollis built rot. That wasn't talent. It was just not quitting, one ugly morning at a time. So if you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Do the right thing even when it costs you and no one is watching, the way Hollis did. Keep your eyes open and keep asking the uncomfortable questions the way Rue did. And when life knocks you flat and tells you you're too weak to get up anyway. They thought I was nothing. They were wrong about the only thing that ever mattered. I was never the one who was weak.